If you look up Bladenboro, North Carolina on a map, you'll see it's surrounded by a lot of thick, swampy pine terrain. But if you drive just about 5 hours northwest into the rugged corners of the state near the Tennessee border, the ground starts to split open into deep limestone country. That's where I was 3 years back in autumn of 2023, tucked away in a remote valley just outside the Marion. My name is Silvester Wick, and for a decade, my entire life was defined by what lies beneath the earth. I'm a cave explorer, or at least I used to be, before that October afternoon changed the way I look at the dark forever. Have you ever sat in a room so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat, only to realize the rhythm wasn't yours? Have you ever looked into a shadow and felt with absolute certainty that the shadow was looking back? I'm telling you this because I need someone else to carry the weight of what we found down there, even if it sounds like the kind of nightmare you try to laugh off the next morning. It started with a cold, relentless wind that didn't just blow through the trees, it seemed to howl directly out of the cracked mouth of the earth itself. It was late October, the kind of autumn where the leaves don't just fall, they rot right on the branches, turning everything a grim, dull brown. My hobby, when I wasn't squeezed into a limestone fissure, was old classic cinema, specifically old black and white noir films where the tension builds through what you don't see. I used to think those directors understood suspense, but real terror isn't a shadow on a studio wall. Real terror is the absolute absence of safety. That week, I had put together a small, tight-knit 3-person team to survey an unmapped cave system on a private tract of timberland. There was Miller, a veteran surveyor who could read rock strata like a book, and Marcus, a younger caver whose enthusiasm usually made up for his lack of nerves. We brought standard gear, heavy-duty climbing ropes, mechanical ascenders, backup headlamps, and a heavy iron crowbar for clearing loose breakdown stone. Because we were in deep, isolated black bear country, Miller also carried a high-caliber revolver on his tactical vest, a detail I originally mocked him for, thinking it was pure overkill. We left the trailhead just as the sun was turning into a pale, weak sliver behind a wall of grey clouds. The wind was brutal that day, rushing through the gorges and making the skeletal trees groan like old floorboards. When we reached the sinkhole entrance, the air changed instantly. It grew stagnant, smelling faintly of old copper and wet fur. We dropped down a 12-foot vertical ledge into the primary chamber, leaving the wind behind, replaced by an oppressive, heavy silence. Marcus was clicking his tongue, listening to the echo return from the deeper tunnels, trying to gauge the volume of the space. "Feels big, Sil," he whispered, his voice sounding thin in the damp air. I nodded, adjusting my pack, feeling that familiar thrill of being the first humans to ever breathe the air in this specific pocket of the world. But as we stepped further from the twilight of the entrance, that thrill began to curdle into a strange, unprovoked sense of dread. The cave didn't behave like standard limestone formations. The walls were strangely jagged, torn apart by ancient tectonic shifts rather than smoothed out by running water. We walked for about 40 minutes, tracking a steady downward slope that led us deeper into the mountain's gut. Then, the floor changed. Instead of clean gravel or solid bedrock, our boots began to crunch against fragments of bone. Miller knelt down, his headlamp beam cutting through the gloom to illuminate a pile of splintered remains. "Deer," he muttered, picking up a section of jawbone that had been snapped completely in half. "Maybe a coyote then?" Marcus suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. I looked closer at the walls. There were deep, vertical gouges in the stone, 4 parallel tracks, lines that scraped through the mineral crust, far too high up the wall for any standard predator to reach. The wind from the surface was completely gone, yet a sudden icy draft blew past our ankles, carrying a stench so foul it made Marcus gag into his sleeve. We pressed on, driven by that stubborn, stupid professional curiosity that keeps cavers going when they should turn back. The tunnel narrowed into a strict crawlway, forcing us down onto our hands and knees. I went first, pushing my gear bag ahead of me, the ceiling scraping hard against my helmet. That's when the silence was broken. It wasn't a rockfall or the shifting of earth. It was a sound that didn't belong underground. The distinct, wet sound of human vocal cords trying to mimic something they weren't built for. It was a voice, high-pitched and trembling, calling out from the dark ahead of us. "Help, please, it's cold." Marcus froze behind me, his breath catching in his throat. "Silvester," he gasped, "is there someone else down here?" But the voice didn't sound right. It was perfectly rhythmic, repeating the exact same cadence every 5 seconds, like a broken recording played at the wrong speed. I held up a hand, signaling them to stop, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The voice didn't come from a person in distress. It came from the throat of something that knew exactly how to use our own humanity against us. The air grew so cold, our breath began to fog heavily in the beams of our lights, obscuring our vision with every exhale. I crawled forward another 2 feet, peeking through the end of the restriction, and saw the tunnel open into a massive, cavernous void. My light swept across the floor of the chamber, revealing a sight that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a massive, subterranean nest constructed from dried moss, dead leaves carried down from some unknown fissure, and hundreds of bleached, shattered bones. And sitting right in the center of that nightmare was a figure, impossibly tall, its emaciated body huddled over a fresh carcass, its skin the color of rotting birch wood. The thing didn't move at first, sitting perfectly still in the beam of my headlamp, like a grotesque plaster cast. Its back was turned to us, a long, hyperextended spine that looked like a row of knuckles pushing hard against translucent, ash-gray skin. It was impossibly lean, its ribs visible even in the dim, scattering light, yet it easily stood 9 or 10 feet tall if it were to strengthen those long, double-jointed legs. Then, with a slow, sickening series of wet clicks, its neck rotated towards us. The face wasn't human, though it possessed a cruel, mocking imitation of one. Its eyes were sunken deep into hollow sockets, glowing with a faint, unholy greenish luminescence. and its lips were tattered away, exposing a jagged row of elongated teeth, stained with black fluid. The air in the chamber instantly dropped below freezing, our breath billowing out in thick, frantic clouds that threatened to blind us. It opened its maw, and the voice that came out was an exact, chilling duplication of Marcus's own voice from just moments prior. "Silvester, is there someone else down here?" The psychological shock of hearing your own friend's voice thrown back at you from a monstrous, skeletal throat is something you can't prepare for. Marcus let out a sharp, involuntary whimper, backing up so fast his helmet cracked hard against the low limestone ceiling of the crawlway. That tiny sound broke the creature's stillness. It didn't turn around or lumber to its feet like an animal. It unfolded itself with terrifying unnatural speed, its long arms ending in blackened, sickle-like claws that scraped violently against the bedrock. "Back! Move back now!" I yelled, my voice echoing off the chamber walls as I scrambled backward through the narrow squeeze, dragging my heavy gear bag as a desperate shield between me and the opening. Behind me, Miller was already moving, his veteran instincts kicking in as he grabbed Marcus by the safety harness and hauled him backward through the dust. The narrowness of the crawlway was the only thing that saved our lives in those first 5 seconds. The creature lunged forward, but its massive 9-foot frame couldn't instantly breach the tight, 3-foot wide stone tube we had crawled through. We heard its claws tearing at the solid limestone, a sound like iron spikes grinding into concrete, accompanied by a foul, sulfuric stench of decay that filled the tight tunnel and made our eyes water. Miller was the first to clear the restriction, pulling himself up onto a wider ledge and the breakdown chamber we had passed through earlier. He reached back, his rough hands gripping the collar of my coveralls and pulling me out of the hole just as a long, pale arm snaked into the crawlway behind me. The arm was impossibly long, the skin stretched so tight over the bone that it looked ready to split, and its black talons missed the heels of my boots by mere inches. "What is that thing? What the hell is that thing?" Marcus was hyperventilating, his headlamp swinging wildly across the ceiling, casting chaotic, dancing shadows. "Shut up and move," Miller roared, drawing the high-caliber revolver from his vest, his hands steady despite the absolute terror radiating through the cavern. We weren't safe. The cave wasn't a linear tunnel, and we knew from our initial map checks that the massive void the creature occupied likely interconnected with the upper ledges of the very chamber we were standing in. The ancient lore of the North Woods speaks of the Wendigo as a spirit of insatiable hunger, a creature born of destruction and human flesh. But seeing it there trapped in the deep, frozen limestone arteries of the earth made it clear that this thing was an absolute physical reality. It was a perfect apex predator of the dark, adapted to hunt by sound, mimicry, and sheer brutal force. Suddenly, the frantic scraping in the crawlway stopped. The silence returned heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of our own ragged breathing and the distant mocking howl of the autumn wind blowing down from the surface entrance hours away. "Did it give up?" Marcus whispered, his eyes wide, his hands trembling as he gripped his aluminium surveyor's rod like a spear. "No," I said, my blood turning to ice as I remembered the layout of the upper fissure. It knows this cave better than we do. It's looking for another way around. Right on cue, a heavy vibration rippled through the solid rock beneath our boots. It wasn't the sound of a creature scurrying, it was a rhythmic, heavy thudding, a series of deliberate massive impacts coming from the darkness above our heads. The thing was climbing the vertical shafts, scaling the sheer rock faces with its claws, intending to cut off our only exit to the surface. The thudding above us grew louder, a sequence of violent, bone-rattling impacts that sent showers of fine limestone dust down onto our helmets. "Run!" Miller shouted, his voice cutting through the panic as he aimed his headlamp toward the steep, ascending breakdown pile that led toward the surface tunnels. We scrambled up the loose, shifting slope of the rock, our boots sliding and kicking away stones that bounced down into the black void below. Marcus was in the lead, driven by pure survival instincts, while Miller and I brought up the rear, our heavy breath fogging so thick in the freezing air that it felt like trying to see through milk. The creature wasn't just pursuing us, it was testing us, utilizing the natural architecture of the cave to amplify the terror of its approach. Every slam of its heavy body against the upper ledges sounded like a small detonation, a deliberate psychological tactic to keep us unhinged. Why had we never heard of a creature like this occupying these deep Carolina fissures before? The answer became starkly clear as we reached the top of the breakdown slope. It didn't leave survivors to tell the tale. As we scrambled into a high, narrow canyon passage, a massive shadow detached itself from the ceiling directly ahead of us, dropping down with a sickening thud that shook the stone floor beneath our feet. It stood between us and our only exit, its long, emaciated limbs bent at sickening predatory angles, its glowing green eyes locking onto Marcus. In the direct beam of our lights, its tattered lips pulled back into a wide and natural grin that split its face almost to its ears. It opened its maw, but instead of a roar, it emitted the deafening, frantic sound of a woman screaming for help, a sound it must have harvested from a victim years or decades ago. Marcus froze, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming horror of the sight, his Cerveus rod dropping from his hands and clattering uselessly against the floor. The creature lunged, its long skeletal arm whipping forward with lightning speed, its black talons tearing through the shoulder strap of Marcus's backpack and dragging him violently toward its gaping mouth. "Get off him," Miller roared, stepping forward with absolute, reckless courage. He leveled the high-caliber revolver and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The deafening reports of the gun inside the enclosed stone canyon were absolutely blinding, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the wet, gray skin of the beast as the heavy bullets hit its chest. The creature let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek, not of pain, but of intense fury, and dropped Marcus, stumbling backward a few steps as dark, viscous fluid leaked from the entry wounds. "Marcus, get up," I yelled, rushing forward and grabbing him by the collar of his safety harness, dragging his limp, terrified body away from the beast. Miller didn't stop firing. He emptied the remaining 3 rounds into the creature's midsection. the smoke from the gunpowder filling the narrow passage and making it impossible to breathe. The heavy impacts of the bullets slowed the creature down, slamming its emaciated body against the jagged canyon walls. But it didn't fall. It slammed its massive fists against the limestone, shattering the rock into deadly splinters, its insatiable hunger overriding any physical damage the gunfire had inflicted. "The crowbar, Silvester! Use the crowbar!" Miller yelled as he frantically tried to reload his revolver with trembling, blood-slicked fingers. I dropped Marcus and unclipped the heavy iron bar from my tactical pack, swinging it with all the strength I had left directly at the creature's extended knee joint. The solid iron crowbar connected with a sickening wet crack right against the creature's hyperextended knee. It was like hitting a column of frozen oak wrapped in leather. The vibration traveled straight up my arms, numbing my fingers instantly and nearly tearing the tool from my grip. The beast shrieked, a sound that split into a sickening layer of Marcus's whimpering voice and a guttural, low-frequency roar that vibrated right in my chest cavity. It buckled, its 9-foot frame dropping to one knee, which gave Miller just enough time to snap his revolver cylinder shut with a heavy metallic click. "Move! Go, go, go!" Miller bellowed, firing 2 more high-caliber rounds directly into the creature's face at point-blank range. The muzzle flashes lit up the monster's hollow eye sockets, blinding it temporarily as black fluid exploded from its tattered cheek, and it slammed its heavy torso against the canyon wall in blind, thrashing agony. I grabbed Marcus under his arms, lifting him by his harness with an adrenaline-fueled strength I didn't know I possessed, and practically threw him up the steep, narrow squeeze that led toward the primary entrance chamber. Miller backed up right behind us, keeping his weapon leveled at the swirling cloud of gunpowder, smoke, and dust where the creature was already pushing itself back up onto its long, double-jointed legs. We could hear it slamming its massive fist against the floor, a rhythmic, furious thudding that grew faster as its insatiable hunger turned into pure, vengeful malice. The temperature in the passage was dropping even lower, our eyelashes freezing, our fingers stiffening inside our tactical gloves as the Wendigo's unnatural winter aura choked out the remaining heat of the cave. We scrambled through the final restriction, our clothes tearing against the jagged limestone walls, until the dim, grey twilight of the autumn afternoon finally spilled over our faces. We had reached the base of the 12-foot vertical drop at the sinkhole entrance, where our climbing ropes hung down like thin lifelines. The wind from the surface was howling violently now, a brutal freezing gale that whipped the dead leaves around our boots in a chaotic dance. "Marcus, ascender on, now!" I screamed, jamming his mechanical ascender onto the rope and pushing his boots into the foot loops. Terrified into compliance, Marcus began hauling himself up the line with frantic, jerky movements, his boots kicking against the mud wall of the sinkhole. Below us, in the pitch-black throat of the tunnel we had just vacated, the human mimicking started again. It wasn't Marcus's voice this time. It was Miller's voice, perfectly duplicated, calling out from the dark, "The crowbar, Silvester. Use the crowbar." The real Miller, standing right beside me, went deadly pale. his knuckles turning white as he gripped his empty revolver. Before the creature could breach the twilight of the entrance, I grabbed the heavy iron crowbar and wedged it deep beneath a massive loose limestone boulder that sat directly above the crawlway exit. A piece of dangerous breakdown stone we had carefully avoided on our way in. "Miller, help me," I roared, throwing my entire body weight onto the iron bar. Miller didn't hesitate. He dropped his gun, grabbed the end of the crowbar with me, and together we gave one final, desperate heave. The iron bar bent under the immense strain, and with a deafening, grinding roar, the 2-ton limestone boulder shifted, slid, and crashed violently down into the mouth of the tunnel, sealing the narrow choke point in a massive explosion of dust and pulverized rock. A heavy, muffled slam vibrated through the floor beneath our feet. The creature striking the other side of the collapsed stone, but the barrier held tight. We didn't wait to see if it could dig its way through. Miller and I grabbed our ropes and climbed out of that sinkhole into the freezing rain and howling wind of the North Carolina mountains in record time. We threw our gear into the back of my truck and drove 5 hours straight back to the safety of Bladenboro without saying a single word. The heater blasting but doing nothing to melt the ice that had settled into our bones. I haven't been down a cave since that day, and I don't think I ever will be again. Sometimes, when the autumn wind hits the windows of my house just right, it sounds exactly like someone I know begging me to let them in from the cold.